Hey, Chris.
Good morning, Tosca.
Hey,
How are you?
we are going to talk today about chasing impact. Yeah, can you set the stage for us, please?
Absolutely. And the idea and the topic today is, are we getting ever more desperate chasing it? The overall feeling that we have and that we discuss with so many of our friends and colleagues in this sector is that nonprofits are here to solve large, complex problems. And the question mark is, can they really do that? Where's the impact? Why are so many organizations that we meet and we know of spend so much time and money to achieve relatively little? And Tosca, you wrote a book, and together in your book with your co-author, I thought it was very interesting. You make a rather provocative claim about the impact and why NGOs exist. So, do you want to take us into that?
Yeah, why don't we set the stage that way? But again, I know you're going to feel free to push back or provide a very different angle. And really, the argument in the book, and I'm talking about our book, Between Power and Irrelevance, the Future of Transnational NGOs, that I co-authored with Hans-Peter Schmitz and George Mitchell. We're basically talking amongst others about what we call the dangerous seduction of the charity architecture in which nonprofits and INGOs are embedded, right? So we are saying that in many countries, not just in global north countries, NGOs are still perceived as charities that are embedded in a legal architecture of the charity structure, right? And we're saying that charity structure has really also deeply influenced our norms, our individual organizational norms and our collective sector norms. In the sense that we basically all that are the legal authorities in our country that oversee nonprofits are looking for is A, that we don't engage in financial malfeasance, right, in fraud. B, that we do not redistribute any profits to our boards, our staff, our donors, etc. And C is that we don't engage much in a legal or policy or political lobbying or activism. And so that kind of pretty low standard expectation has really imbued NGOs with an aura of trustworthiness in the eyes of the donor, whether that is institutional donors, high wealth individuals, or small individual donors. So we're saying in the book that this image of trustworthiness is further enhanced because NGOs are perceived to take minimal risks, right? Minimal risk, again, of fraud and misappropriation. We also strive for low overhead. Whether that's a good thing or not is a very different question, but we do. We continue to do that. We kind of suppress the salaries of our staff to some extent because that is part of the norms of our sector. And we tend to avoid debt or accumulating a lot of financial reserves or we tend to avoid taking big financial risks. So on top of that, one could also argue, maybe provocatively, that NGOs often, except in the case of humanitarian relief and direct services like food kitchens, etc., produce outcomes that are pretty hard to observe in the first place. Okay. And then there is that information asymmetry where neither the program participant or beneficiary or whatever you want to call them, nor the donor has a lot of insight into how NGOs actually produce outcomes or outputs. So that's part one of a broader argument. Let me stop there, Chris, and see how you respond to that.
Yeah, I read your book twice, actually. I thought it was really, really good. And that point you've made is, I agree with. I would even add to this. I mean, what you're saying here basically is for NGOs to be trusted, they sort of need to be of a makeup and of a work ethic that just doesn't do any harm, has low overheads, and
Right.
they can be easily pushed aside, dismantled, or hard to observe. And it sounds to me like those who are busy building a better world, those who are trying to improve society for us, for our humans around us, for our countries, for our continent, for the planet, should like be easily cast aside, whilst the grown up do the business. And we cement them in an architecture. That's what I took from your book. I would love to hear whether I got this right. We're cementing them in an architecture that is defined by what they don't do. No profit, no malfeasance, no risk.
Exactly.
Basically, no biggie impact.
Yeah, that is another provocative statement that you're making, Chris. But I think that is indeed part of what we're saying. And by the way, when you use the word, basically a do no harm mentality, we don't mean that, of course, in the context of, let's say, environmental or social safeguards.
No.
We don't mean it in terms of avoiding sexual abuse or other forms of harassment and bullying in the workplace. But I think that sense of a do no harm is further exacerbated by the fact that we assume, and we're rather proud of the fact that we have good intentions, right? And then there is the kind of leap of assumption where we say we have good intentions, so we must be producing outcomes or at least outputs that are useful to society. So that kind of further darkens the picture, if you will.
But it's almost like as long as we are hoping for something good, we are therefore good, so we can't be criticized to not do something.
Exactly. And that hoping for something good, by the way, we also argue in the book, and by the way, this is not all of our own thinking. There is a particular author, his name is Seibel, who we quote, or Seibel, maybe I'm saying it wrong, who first came up with this argument is, we know from psychology and from neuroscience that people, that our donors may well be choosing to believe that we produce outcomes because that is what makes us feel better, right? And that is primarily what we're looking for. We're looking for that warm glow of giving as donors so that we have a sense that we are doing something that is good, even if we don't really know how much good it does.
Right. So let me push you a little bit further, because this is really, I think many people agree with that, and many people say, okay, well, what now? We have this psychological bias that you just described. We have the cask into a no risk, no biggie, no profit, no malfeasance, no harm casket and set up. So what now? If you accept, or if you believe that we live in a world that is overcrowded, burning, where we have a lot of problems to address, not just, but also the SDGs. Only 8 years left for that.
Of course.
If you are taking the approach saying, you know what, we do need NGOs and other organizations that do good on various fronts to have more of an impact, how does that realization you've described as help us? How do we get out of that? Can we evolve from that? Or are you basically saying, look, NGOs are on the right vehicle?
I'm not saying that last point, but I am saying the incentive systems are not sufficiently in place. They are starting to come up, if you will, right? So if you see, for instance, here in the United States, and talking about Charity Navigator, which is in the United States a very kind of traditionally or historically controversial actor in the sector, in the sense that Charity Navigator, the largest web-based nonprofit rating mechanism in the US, that historically used to only rate nonprofits on their on very narrow financial indicators, and then in a later stage also on some fairly essential but narrow kind of governance and transparency indicators. Now, Charity Navigator is really upping a domain for rating, which is about outcomes and results. So that is, for instance, one way in which the needle may be moved, because Charity Navigator in the US here has a fair amount of influence on both the thinking of small donors as well as some institutional donors and high wealth individuals. So that may start moving the needle. Once nonprofits know they are being rated amongst others on results, and the section on results is weighted relatively heavily, in proportion, for instance, to these narrow financial indicators, that might move the needle. So I think the landscape is changing. The screws are being tightened, in other words, in terms of outcomes, right? And of course, we've had 10 years at least of a much kind of blossoming evaluation practice and discipline and funding to going to evaluation and more internal capacity building. So I think, again, the landscape is changing, but I still think that the incentive systems are relatively weak for becoming more precise about what outcomes we're actually producing.
Yeah, that completely echoes with what I'm experiencing. So if I were to summarize that, I feel sometimes, I've been working, my colleagues and I have been working with charities for about 10 years now, or 15 years now, coming on for quite a while. And there are sort of two archetypal, stereotypical characters that we tend to meet every day. There's the more traditional manager who manages to a relatively bureaucratic, very non-profit in that traditional sense, like do no harm, do no impact, no profit, make no risk, make no relatively constrained organization. They talk to us about all the things they cannot do, that they have never done, that they shouldn't do, that they are not. I mean, even the word non-governmental organization, non-private organization, there's a lot of no's in that language. And then there's the other one, and they tend to be more entrepreneurial. They said, look, we are living in an age where we just need to build a better world, and we need to finally do it, not just talk about it, not just almost will it into existence. We need to therefore turn our organization into these impact building machines. And that I personally find that more interesting, but I also find that is more humble when they look at their own organization and saying, look, we have this many people affected by that particular problem, be it torture, be it women's rights, be it water and shelter, humanitarian action, whatever it is you're talking about. There will be some sort of baseline. And if they then say, look, we need to at least solve the problem by 10%, then that changes the entire board situation. It changes the ambition. And here's my question to you. When you are talking little impact versus massive problem, probably growing, do your colleagues in the sector in the US then tend to rally up and say, okay, let's do it? Or do they tend more to frustrate and use that language of no?
Well, that's a very binary question. And just to note, my client organizations and other NGOs that I interact with are not all only those that are based in the US. In fact, they are based in some other continents as well. But how can I answer your fairly binary question? I would say there is a moderate surge to get to more impact.
Right.
One thing that I'm still struck by, and I think, you and I like to talk amongst us about organizational cultures, right? So the set of shared habits and behaviors that either, in this case, promote an outcome and a performance orientation or that don't. And one thing that strikes me is where I see a lack of surge or interest or appetite is, if we want to create more impact, we also need to know better what is the cost effectiveness of our every unit of outcome or output that we produce. And I think a lot of nonprofits don't know what that cost efficiency or cost effectiveness per unit of outcome is, with the exception of those that produce very simple, straightforward outputs, such as in a food kitchen, for instance.
Yeah. Yes.
And now, admittedly, the methodology for coming up with a better cost efficiency evaluation is growing. It's not non-existent, it's growing, but it's not fully fledged yet. But I see a relatively little curiosity in that aspect. In other words, could we actually produce more outcomes for our $100 of spending than we currently do? What do you think about that?
Well, you're basically saying, can we measure our bang and get more bang for each buck?
Yes.
To put it bluntly. And yes, I agree. There are the organizations that my colleagues and I work with. We have this conversation about cost effectiveness, almost weekly level. And there are two reactions when we sit in these rooms that really strike me. Number one is the micromanager, I call it, the person who or the cultural impact that wants to reduce the costs all the time, reduce the overheads, not spend on this, not spend here, not invest into that training, capacity building, baseline, new infrastructure tool, or even a car, because it can somehow be done cheaper.
Yeah.
I think underlying that is a tense. Underlying that seems to be a notion of doing anything on the cheap, everything temporary, and everything sort of very light touch, and then being perpetually surprised that it didn't have enough impact. That sounds like madness to me. The other one is what you just described, the fact that, look, we live in a complex world with multi-layered impact, and we do have interventions that we know how they work, but we don't know how they are affecting the problem. And my reaction to this is, so what? Okay, let's get over this complex language. The world is complex, so what? Do we use that complexity as an excuse not to measure our impact and to somehow justify and actually hide behind it?
Yeah.
Or are we doing the saying, okay, we probably can't measure our impact to the last degree, because how do you measure progression in women's rights? But guess what? There are some indicators. There are some metrics which give us, if we use 5 or 10 of them, give us some good indication on how, if we're progressing or not.
Yeah.
And yes, the attribution might be difficult, but so what? I think this so what question is incredibly important. And if not asked and if not confronted, the complexity and the attribution problem can sometimes serve as a wonderful excuse not to do something, or not to invest, or not to scale.
Yeah, that's true. And we are probably not, you said, if not asked, we're probably still, as a sector, still not asked enough about this, right? Because historically, the demands on us were pretty minimal, right? So again, we keep our overhead as low as possible, and we avoid scandals, and we'll be okay, right?
Yeah, you sort of fly under the radar.
Exactly. The benefits have been pretty lucrative because we have that automatic baseline of trustworthiness, because we do not reinvest our profits in ourselves, etc. And the risks have been historically, if you look at the last 3 or so decades, have been pretty minimal, because our fiscal survival, or maybe even thriving, if you see look at the rapid growth of certain NGOs, let's say between 1990 and 2005 or so, our fiscal survival or even thriving has been quite uncoupled from our mission success. So I think that has really culturally been a problem in becoming more rigorous and not asking that question, as you say, of ourselves, and waiting for the donors and other external kind of raters, etc., to ask that question. So you get that conformity to the legacy architecture that has been quite comfortable. We know it's changing. Many are no longer growing. In fact, some are really in decline financially. So it's getting tougher. So maybe we should talk a little bit about what, from your experience and my experience, what does it take, Chris, to develop a more evidence-based and outcome and performance-based culture? What's your experience?
Well, I wanted to just throw that question to you, believe it or not.
Okay.
Because it's what we're discussing here is And since you've asked first, I'll give you a setup maybe. What we're discussing here is a mindset shift, as well as a management shift, as well as then a process and a system shift. Now, I believe that culture is the most important thing in a organization. And we're talking about culture in the entire sector here, right? I personally am, there's no doubt, I believe we live in a hot, crowded, unjust world. And in order to have any chance of building a better world, we need to, NGOs are essential, but NGOs that chase impact, that are becoming real impact building machines. I believe that an NGO isn't something to put in the annex of a governmental budget or as an expression of nice thinking. I think we need a thinking shift internally and externally. And that thinking shift is sometimes hard to inspire. It is individuals who are thinking about their NGO more actionable, I would call it, find it difficult to convince their colleagues. And the three things that I would love to hear what you think how to do this, Tosca, are the three questions like this. How do we get from properly funded versus we're just given some money? Number two is, how are we getting from wishful thinking and intentions to we're actually managed by the data? And therefore that induces some realism. And how do we get from we're doing what we can to we are capable at managing at scale when the problem scales or has scaled? So we're measuring our impact in relationship to the problem. That shift from we're managing with everything we can, but what we have, versus, okay, we don't have enough, we're rallying and going for it. How do you manage that mindset shifts in the culture and the organization? How do you think?
Well, I'm daring, at least initially, to only bite off number two a little. So
okay.
Let me get us started on number two, because I've done some work on that in the past, and it is indeed about culture change, which is a topic that I love.
Yes.
So in the NGOs that I worked with and or studied, I find that a learning culture that really values data and data-driven decision-making is one in which it has several components. Let me start with one. The fact that I mention it as the first one does not necessarily mean it's the most important one or the only one. So we need champions within the executive leadership that actually invest time and build their understanding what kind of data, what the meaning of data is, what is the potential, as well as what are the limitations, so that we don't misuse data, for instance, to cherry pick, right? Or to have our communications and fundraising departments kind of run away with it and while cherry picking. So executive leadership members who invest time in understanding what data is, how to analyze it, and how to use it, because that will help with broad buy-in. When staff see that leaders really care about data and pay attention to it, again, staff, from a culture shaping perspective, watch what leaders do, not what they say, but what they do. So if they say senior leadership using data to inform strategic decision making, then they start to pay more attention. So that is one. Secondly, is you need obviously you need a clear organizational strategy and a theory of change, so that you actually can map back your data to whether the theory of change is actually being both followed, if you will, and is resulting in the changes that it assumed it would bring. You need a clear audience and purpose for the data, and also incentive systems. So I see in organizations where staff, especially at the country level, colleagues are expected to input into data systems for evaluation purpose. So program data, organizational effectiveness data, etc. efficiency of system data, etc. I see
Mm-hmm.
that staff are asked to do a lot of inputting, but they're not asked for input into what are the learning questions. What do we want to find out through this data collection, right? If they have an input into that, in other words, if they can infuse the data gathering strategy with things they are curious about and that would help them in their work, they would see more incentive than just being asked to input a lot of data. So that I
Can
think
I,
is,
can I just give an? I think you're so right. And do you mind if I interrupt you and give
of
an
course,
example
go
of that?
ahead.
Uh, Just last week, worked with a fantastic organization that has turned exactly that dynamic that you're just describing around, and I was really impressed by it.
Mm,
And it's been a long time since we've been working together. And it's starting to bear some fruits, which I'm pleased to note. And they have turned the strategy process around.
mm,
They said, "Look, we're also devolving to the south. We are generally shifting power, and that means shifting power on those metrics that matter. We are
yeah.
not deciding what matters anymore. The donors aren't deciding what matters." And they've used the objectives and key results framework. So the objectives of the organization are set in the grand strategy, but then the strategy stops and let the individual countries set the results to achieve the objective. The
I
only
see.
ask was make sure you set key results that are doable, measurable, and that you believe achieve the objective,
Mm,
so, or give the best chance of achieving it. And
right.
the objective itself was purposely designed to be a little bit vague, quite inspirational, and just a little bit impossible, I would dare say. So
Mm,
it's a little
a
bit of a
stretch
stretch. Yeah.
objective. Mm,
And then the key results beneath saying, look, these are our global objectives. You in Ethiopia, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in Colombia. You set your own key results because you know your country best. You know how to work.
mm,
And the breadth and the variety of strategic initiative that came back within 2 weeks from the member countries was incredible. No consultant, no board could have ever written that strategy. It is far too localized. It was, and what's even more important, local leaders cared about it.
mm.
And I loved that versus another in IGO we're working with, where we're doing a process analysis, and we found out that their M&E process, you can already tell by the language, it's an M&E process,
Mm-hmm.
basically worked to the regulations of the donor.
Right.
And no more than that. There was no question how much impact is there. Yes, there is some, theory of change is meant to prove this, but frankly, it's 4 years old. It's pre-pandemic. The world has changed, but yeah, we still need to do it.
Yeah.
I happened to speak to both organizations on the same day, and I thought the diversity in how they manage the same topic was incredible.
Yeah, that's really interesting to juxtapose those two examples.
Yes.
Right.
Thanks for that
Yeah.
word.
I wonder, have you seen also examples in which this evidence and outcome focused culture also comes through in job descriptions, comes through in what people are hired for and how hiring happens, right? How selection happens, whether it is part of performance management. We're still talking about culture here. So all these organizational systems and processes and in the lifespan of a person as that person kind of travels through the organization, if you will, if there are these touch points where outcome and performance comes up and is being asked about, that is also one way in which we can inculcate a stronger performance oriented culture, I feel. And when then senior leaders hold up those people who are most outcome focused, if you will, and celebrate them as organizational heroes, that can be quite influential, because then others
I
want to
agree.
imitate.
No, I agree. I think one of the greatest. I mean, we live in an age where recruitment is really difficult, where resources, time, and money is very short. and we need to get this right, because without the right people, there's no chance that we can possibly have the impact of improving the world.
Right.
Simple as that.
Right.
But I think one of the greatest dissatisfactions why people are quitting, or even worse, they're not applying themselves to the job, is because they don't know to what they're supposed to do. The job description is too vague. It describes activities, not outcomes. Do this rather than achieve this. I think once you managed to agree, and you can't really dictate it, you have to agree. This is what we like to achieve together in the next 6 months, 1 year, 4 years, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then if you're equally humble about it, saying, we believe that this will produce the impact we're hoping. No, we won't know until we do it.
Right.
There's no way of knowing this. And
Right.
that's okay.
Yeah.
Let's accept the ambiguity. That's life. But once you've managed to agree that with your colleagues or your staff worldwide and saying, these are the outcomes that you are responsible for, then they can go to work every Monday morning and remind themselves, okay, this month or this week, I'm hiring 15 employees. I am running a logistics center. I am writing 5 articles or whatever it is you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And they have set themselves those tasks. I think this outcome-based management is the culmination of leaders acknowledging that the future is inherently uncertain, that it cannot be forecasted, that predictive strategies don't work because we can't predict the future anymore, but also a humbleness of saying, you know what, my staff, we're all adults.
Yeah.
You're an expert. If you tell me, if I have a feeling that you understand the objective of our country office, of our organization, or of your team, then you set your own outcomes and results, and you communicate them publicly, and you tie your name and your success and your career progression to that.
Okay,
outcome.
and there is what you said, publicly. So that can create a real incentive, right? To be transparent about what we say we wanted to achieve, and then to be transparent about the actual results. And I think our sector still has a bit of growing up to do around that, right? In fact, I would argue, as you know, Chris, many missions of many NGOs are so broadly stated that it's impossible to ever figure out whether we actually have bitten off a chunk. So instead of saying, you talked about the 10%, right?
Yes.
I think there might be a purpose behind it. Yes, of course, it's very inspirational to say that you want to rid the world of poverty. But how is that? I mean, that's not a credible a mission in my end. You would have to be a little bit more exacting around what portion of what poverty are you trying to make a 10% change in.
Right. I completely agree with you. And using that exact example years ago, or two examples which tie into what you're saying, is years ago there was work with a large NGO that wanted to introduce and advance cash transfer programs.
Okay.
And the cash that was then seen as a model innovation. It was just sort of seen critically. You remember those days, about 5 to 10 years ago, this was seen as something quite radical. Until a then fairly young, in his late 20s, program manager went to the board and said, all right, people, our NGO includes poverty reduction. Fundamentally, people are poor because they don't have any money. So we're going to give them more money and let the market do the rest. And our output is to increase their income by 20% by spending X.
Right.
End of strategy. That little presentation turned out to now be over 80% of that organization's programming. And that was not because cash transfers work so fantastically, but because it was measurable. It was clear. The ambition was okay. There were lots of challenges. How do you disperse in a conflict area, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But the ambition was clear, and everybody who worked in that team ended up working far more efficiently and effectively because they knew what they had to disperse.
Right. So they were more rowing on the same boat, or whatever the saying is. Yeah, that's really interesting.
No, that's very true.
Go ahead.
No, I think that is a very pragmatic example of how strategy then becomes more outcome focused and people became more outcome focused. So that NGO, just to give a little bit more insight there, ended up buying a bank, which is amazing. And if you suggest that to any other NGO, they would probably just throw the book at your head or something and think, hang on, no, we're not buying a bank. But it was not a question, didn't even go to the board because, well, we need to disperse this amount of cash and banks disperse cash. There are no banks in this region, so we're just buying the bank.
Yeah, so that is talking about your third question about what are we doing to when the problem scales. You remember your third question?
Yes.
Yes. It sounds like that organization kind of stepped up to the plate in that sense. Do you want to talk more about what your answer would be to that third one? Because I'm not sure how to tackle that at first. Let me see what comes up in your head.
Yeah, it sort of goes back to the original point. When we have a mission that is relatively well defined, but we have limited resources,
Right.
which we all do as NGOs.
Right.
I think there are two mindsets which you can manage. Number one is, well, we're doing the best with the resources we have, and we are trying to tinker around the efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe do a little bit more with a little less staff, with a little bit more digital. But frankly, you're not going to make an impact on the problem. And you have this permanent, almost daily excuse. Well, that's the money the donors give us. Well, it's a very complex environment. I hate that excuse. Or there are those who are more output focused, as you put it, saying, look, the problem of children illiteracy, or fresh water provision, whatever it may be, is getting worse, and by comparison, therefore, our impact is getting lower, smaller. Or if you put it in the private sector language, our market share in the problem is getting or better even, our market share in the potential solution of this problem is being reduced,
diminished.
Now, I don't want to, use the private sector as the tutor of the NGO sector. I think it should be the other way around, in fact. But the language is useful here.
Yeah.
If we are not talking about problem solving or impact generation, but about market share in a solution, then automatically everybody thinks, well, if our solution market share becomes less, that's a big problem for us.
Yeah.
And there are those who then present that data at scale to the organization, and within a few months, the organization tends to change with the data around how the problem is increasing and how relatively little our impact is therefore changing. To give one final pragmatic example, there's an organization in the US that we work with at the moment, where they have a resource problem. So they just didn't get enough funding in, but they also suspected that they are not, using all the income available to them or available in the sector. There are more grants, there's more foundations, there's more private corporate partnerships that they could foster, etc. But they couldn't convince the board to spend the money. So all they've done is saying, dear MZN, could you just go away and every month present us the amount of funding that would have been available to us this month if we had the resources to send that proposal, go and meet that corporate partnership, apply for that foundation grant, do that commercial contract. So it was a range of things. And we didn't do anything but present the funding forgone. And that was quite a powerful way of doing it, because within 3-4 months, the conversations changed, saying, well, we could have helped that particular problem. We could have helped this region if we would have applied for this and that grant, but we didn't do it because of our internal resource constraint.
Right.
And then they invested into that resource constraint.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
was, I think, quite a good way of the responsible manager to affect internal change
Internal shaking up a mindset.
without being in your face. He just said, look, all we're doing is we're measuring what we didn't get.
Right, right. But it's your observation that it does seem to have, yeah, shaken up some mindset and have made people realize. So maybe we can aspire for greater scale. That's what I hear you're saying.
Yes, because it forces one to think, okay, there is additional funds in this particular example, different funds on the corporation funds on the table that we didn't use. The question, why didn't we use it when we really generally want to address the problem, then becomes inescapable.
And more urgent. Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
you do that for you do that for 90 days, it's going to have an effect on your board.
Right. Right. Yeah. So we've talked quite a bit in this episode about kind of mental models and mindsets, right, that are part of culture. Maybe realizing that we probably have to bring this conversation to a close in the next couple of minutes. So in the book, we basically are saying, listen, on the one hand, NGOs have really scaled up their espoused aspirations. What I mean by that, we're saying now, compared to 20 years ago, that we want to have a serious impact on longer term structural, systemic, right, societal problems, right? But at the same time, our systems for both measuring but also for incentivizing an outcome orientation, right, and our ways of promoting a more outcome oriented cultures are still quite underdeveloped, and we're also not very transparent about them, about our results. So we're saying in the book, listen, either we have to walk back our aspirations that we are here to promote long-term structural change, or the ways of demonstrating achievement and the ways, therefore, of first measuring achievement need to step up. We can't continue in this way. So that's one thing that I feel is important to leave with. What do you think?
Yes, I agree. I think that's a good finalizing sentence. I would only add that I would highly encourage anybody who works at a charity, at a international governmental organizations, who says, look, we need to make more of an impact, to build in a process that shows the size of the problem versus the size of the resources we have. And let that one play out. It's going to have an effect at some point soon.
Sink in. Let that one sink in. Yeah. So maybe with that, Chris, do you think we will bring this to a close?
I think so. I think this was a very good, very large, very fundamental conversation. Tosca, thank you so much for your book again. I recommend anybody reading it. Really, it's a good one.
Oh, thank you.
And maybe we can include a link in the description of this podcast.
Sure.
And Tosca, pleasure to talk to you again.
It always is, Chris, and I've enjoyed these 3 episodes. I hope people will find them somewhat useful. See you next time.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.